Chapter 481. Maisie said to the middle-aged man. He had been fired, but he couldn't complain. He was happy to be able to walk away alive. Maisie picked up her phone and replied to Riley's message. She had secretly been in contact with Riley in the past 3 years. But she hadn't told her where she was. She only knew that she was abroad. Maisie had found out that the Lucas family and her grandfather had been searching for her through her communication with Riley, and the children were happy with the Goldmans. Waylon was groomed to become the next successor, like Nolan, and was constantly by Titus' side. However, she had never asked about Nolan. Why did Waylon have to take over Nolan's role at this young age, and why would the Goldmans suddenly take all of them under their wing? Maisie picked up a few photos. She hadn't shown herself to anyone for the past 3 years she had been in Norwich, and the media there had no idea what she looked like either. All they knew was that Mr. Henry had a daughter named Alice. But now, someone was using the employees of Hants Palace to take pictures of her. Did someone find out that she was staying there? Could it be him? Maisie walked toward the study, and the 2 guards waiting at the door nodded to her. "Ma'am." Maisie nodded, pushed the door to the study open, and saw Strix speaking to a man in the study. The man turned around, and she was surprised. "Uncle Irwin?" Irwin got up and smiled. "It's been a while." Strix stood up too. "I was just going to tell you that Irwin came back." Maisie walked toward them with a light smile. "Dad. Am I interrupting your reunion with Uncle Irwin?" Strix touched her hair, his eyes filled with love. "Of course not. All right, now that Irwin is back, you should have a good chat since you're closer to him. I need to get some work done." Strix buttoned up his suit and left the room. Irwin turned around and looked at Maisie. "Have you been doing well for the past 3 years, Z?" "Yes," Maisie nodded and smiled. "Dad has been good to me, probably because of his love for Mom." Something came to her mind, and she asked, "What about you? I heard that you weren't in Zlokova. Where have you been?" Irwin sat down on the couch. "I had to settle something in Staslo at that time and got into a bit of trouble." "What trouble?" Maisie looked at him worriedly, remembering that when she had returned to Staslo with that person, Irwin hadn't been back yet. Had something happened to Irwin in Staslo? Irwin picked up the cup of coffee and took a sip, looking stoic. "It's nothing. I ruined their plan, and they wanted to take revenge. I was lucky, so I survived." Maisie looked down. If something had happened to him, he wouldn't be here. Irwin had helped her in the past too, but she didn't think that it would bring trouble. "Z, Strix told me what happened 3 years ago. I'm sorry. I wished I was there." Irwin looked at her. Maisie paused, then smiled. "It's all right. It's in the past now." "Did you know who caused that accident?" Irwin asked. Maisie frowned and held her hands together. She would never forget about the accident where her father and Sherry died in an explosion. The only clue was that before that had happened, the person she had seen was Rowena. Chapter 482. Maisie answered, "I can't confirm because before it happened, I saw Rowena, but I can't be sure if it was her." Rowena's name hadn't popped up in the past 3 years, and she had sent people to look into her. There was no news of her in Staslo either. Irwin put down the cup and placed a photo he took out of his pocket on the table. "I received this photo a year ago. I guess it was for me to investigate." Maisie looked at the photo. It was a woman who was in the crowd after the incident in a mask and cap. The height and build of the woman looked exactly like Rowena's. Maisie raised her head in surprise. "Uncle Irwin, who sent the incident photo to you?" Irwin squeezed a word out. "Him." Maisie didn't ask, but her eyes grew dark. She didn't want to confirm if it were him and that he was looking into the incident. Irwin asked, "Do you hate him, Z?" "Hate?" Maisie didn't know if she did because he had never done anything for her to hate him, but she resented him for breaking promises, for being cruel, and for not looking for her all these years. Even if someone was sneaking in pictures or wanted to know her true identity, she didn't want to confirm if that person was him. It could be the Lucas family or her grandfather trying to find out. If it were him, he would have shown up already. If he had his suspicions, he would have come to Morwich, but he never showed up there. Maybe he had already moved on, but why was he looking into the incident? Was it because of Sherry? Yes, Sherry had died, and Quincy lost a sister. Even if he didn't investigate, Quincy would have. Seeing her dismay, regret, and sadness, Erwin took a deep breath. If you expected him to come to see you, you should know that it's probably impossible. Probably impossible? Maisie was stunned but bounced back. Her eyes mocked herself. Was she still waiting for him to come to find her? Erwin calmly replied, because he can't come. Maisie was again stunned, and suspicion arose. She asked without meaning to, why? Erwin saw that she still cared, even after 3 years. That man was a thorn in her heart that couldn't be pulled out, yet she wouldn't dare touch it. He sighed. He's sick. Rumor has it that he's very sick and won't last much longer. That's not possible. Maisie suddenly stood up. Wasn't he fine 3 years ago? How could you be sure that he was healthy if you didn't see it for yourself? Erwin looked at her with a smile. That was probably the reason he chose to ask for a divorce. Maisie stood in the spot. Could her heart keep calm and continue to lie to herself? Maybe not. She knew that Nolan had been hiding something when he insisted on ending their relationship with a divorce. When Titus had first asked him to get a divorce, he wouldn't, but why did he suddenly agree to it when he returned from Staslo? Was Nolan really sick? Maisie asked while shaking, and her voice broke. How did he fall sick? Erwin said calmly. He caught it while in Staslo. No way. Maisie sat down, her face pale. How could he be sick in Staslo on top of getting shot? Chapter 483. If you ask him personally, you might get the answer. Erwin raised his brow and smiled. But with your current status, do you still care about the people in your past? He could be a half-dead bedridden man with a few years left in him now. And he was the one who asked for a divorce. Do you really want to go back? His speech made Maisie stand on her spot with her thoughts hanging. Riley was still working at the same cafe. There weren't a lot of customers in the morning, so she could hear when someone walked in but didn't look up. Hello, what can I get you? 1 latte. Riley's finger shuddered, and she raised her head when she heard that voice. She smiled when she saw that it was Louis. Why are you here? I can't get a cup of coffee? Louis frowned. Riley already keyed in the order. Of course you can. She turned around to make it and placed it on the counter when she was done. Your latte. He calmly said, to go. Riley took back the cup and put it in a holder. Louis looked at her with his palm on the counter. Are you really not in touch? Riley was a little impatient after being asked again. She looked up and handed the coffee to him. No, Louis waited before taking it. When he was about to leave, he saw a message pop up on her phone screen that was placed on the counter. Riley picked up the phone in a panic and stared at him. Are you trying to pry? Louis raised his brow. Why are you so nervous? Are you dating someone? Riley laughed. Yes, a guy is interested in me. He's cute and sweet. She looked at her message. Louis stared at her and scoffed. You should cancel our engagement before you start dating someone. Riley didn't look up. Sure, tell Aunt Larissa and my dad. We just need them to agree. He laughed when he heard that. Why don't you go? Even though the two of them were forced to be together because their family wanted a union, he wouldn't go to see her if she wasn't the only one who might know where Maisie was. His mother and her father had decided their marriage. He hadn't rejected it because he didn't want to go through matchmaking blind dates. And since those women probably wanted him because of his status and family background, he would have a hard time if they wouldn't leave him when they got married. It was different for Riley, though. Not only did she not stick to him, but she also avoided him. Thus, marriage with her would be more comfortable for him than with any other pesky woman. Maybe he was just getting by and didn't want to face the women on blind dates. And that was why he had never thought of calling off their arrangement. Nonetheless, he knew that they would have to get engaged and even married one day. He wouldn't want to be tied down by marriage, especially not to a woman he didn't know. He knew Riley. Even though she was a pretty average person, choosing a woman who would stay out of his business like her wouldn't be too bad if they were to get married. Riley looked at him. "Why don't you go then?" Louis shrugged. "Do you think I can manage that?" "What are you talking about?" "Do you think I can?" "You're being annoying. Go away and stop bugging me." Riley walked aside to reply to her message. Why did Z suddenly ask about Nolan? That was tough. She hadn't been concerned about Nolan in the past 3 years because of how he had treated Maisie. Chapter 484. Right when Riley was going to reply, her phone was taken away, and she was shocked. "Louis, give me back my phone." She almost ran out to get her phone back. Louis saw something and saw someone running toward him, so he raised his arm higher. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall. And Riley couldn't even touch his hand. "Jump," Louis challenged her, "shorty." Riley was furious. She kicked his knee, and Louis knelt down because he was caught off guard. He looked up and gnashed his teeth. "Riley." Riley grabbed her phone, took a few steps back, and smiled proudly. "I'm not going to let you show off." "Haha." Louis stood up and laughed. "Great, Riley, remember that. You'll need me one day." He turned around angrily and left. Riley immediately replied to Maisie's message after he left. But she suddenly received another message that made her gasp. A rental car stopped outside the Goldman Mansion's gate in the afternoon, and Riley got out. She looked at this villa that was as big as the Royal Gardens, but it felt so quiet. She took a deep breath, feeling vexed. The Goldman Mansion had always had tight security. No one could ever just walk in. It was far from how it used to be. As expected, a security guard stopped her when she was trying to go in. "Who are you here to see, miss?" Riley flashed a huge grin. "I'm here to see Mr. Goldman." The security guard suspected something, so Riley changed her narrative. "Can you get Quincy to come to see me?" It would probably be easier to see Quincy if she couldn't meet Nolan. The guards looked at each other. And one of them put a hand to his ear as if he was speaking to someone. After a while, he looked at her and asked, "Your name, please." She replied, "Riley Hill." The man walked aside. "Mr. Lawson," she said, "her name is Ms. Riley Hill." "Riley?" Quincy turned to look at Nolan. She had never come to see Nolan. Why would she? Nolan was wearing a clean and tidy shirt, meticulously buttoned all the way to his collar. He was reading a document at the desk, unaffected, and didn't seem like he would ask the reason she was here. Quincy hesitated and spoke to the person on the other end. "I'll go see her." Quincy pursed his lips when he saw how calm Nolan was and walked downstairs. Riley, who got past security, walked to the door and saw Quincy walking out of the villa. "How can I help you, Miss Hill?" Riley scratched her face and awkwardly asked, "Nothing much. I just want to know how Mr. Goldman has been doing." Quincy paused, then frowned. "Did Ms. Vanderbilt ask you to ask?" Riley shuddered and looked nervous. "Of course not. I just wanted to know." Riley wasn't good at covering up her lies. Quincy saw through her right away because she was obviously lying. He looked down and said, "Please ask Ms. Vanderbilt to stop asking about Mr. Goldman." Riley was stunned and gnashed her teeth. That's true. They're divorced, so it wouldn't matter to Maisie even if he died. I shouldn't have come. She doesn't have to know. Chapter 485. Riley was leaving when Quincy said, Mr. Goldman has his reasons. Riley paused and turned around, but Quincy had already gone back inside. In the study, Nolan looked out the window and remembered something. The coldness he exuded turned bone-chilling. And Quincy felt that when he got to the door. Mr. Goldman, Ms. Hills left, he said. Nolan was focused, but he just nodded. Quincy frowned when Nolan didn't ask. Mr. Goldman, are you not going to ask why she was here? Nolan didn't look affected. But the hand on his leg was clutched tight while his eyes were cold. It doesn't matter anymore. Quincy glanced at him and didn't say anything more. Saying that it didn't matter was a lie. Anyone could tell how important Maisie was to him and how she was the dearest person to him. If it didn't matter, he wouldn't have investigated the accident from 3 years ago and tried to find news of her all over the world, nor would he have sent someone to Morwich. He hadn't searched for Maisie himself because he was afraid of losing control if he saw her. At that moment, Quincy answered a call, and he was shocked. Are you sure? The person on the other end confirmed, and then Nolan looked at him. What's wrong? Quincy moved the phone away and said, the de Armas, something happened. Nolan closed the file and frowned. Be specific. Quincy told him. We have intel that Hernandez was attacked and has gone missing. Now Roger's people are taking over the de Armas. It looks like Roger is helping the Kents. Ever since Hernandez had learned about the ploy and manipulation, and after Maisie's accident, he had been playing mind games with the Kents, and the two families had been in a terrible feud in Staslo. Hernandez had been bullying the Kents, and since they were nobles on Roger's side, they were his most useful pawns. If the Kents fell, Roger would have lost an ally among the royal family. It looked as though Roger was cornered and worried that the de Armas would work together with the Goldmans, so he tried to wipe out the de Armas. Once they lost their power, it would affect the Goldmans too. Nolan pressed his lips together, had an idea, and looked up. Is the election of Staslo happening this year? Yes, Quincy paused, then asked, are you? Nolan's eyes darkened. He could guess the reason Roger was rushing to take action. The candidate is on his side. So the de Armas vote is crucial. What if Hernandez couldn't attend and someone took his place? Quincy was surprised because if it were true, Roger would pretty much have the government in the palm of his hands. If that happened, Staslo would be in a mess. Nolan suddenly looked outside. His deep eyes looking calmer. He slowly said, help me get flight tickets to Staslo. Quincy was nervous. But, your health. Nolan tapped his finger on the desk and solemnly said, book it. Seeing how adamant he was, Quincy nodded. When he left, Nolan's eyes looked foggy. At Morwich. It was nighttime at St. Page. The entire Hants Palace looked like a black pearl lost in a huge area in the middle of the city, shining from inside out. In the brightly lit study, Strix asked to see Maisie. She went in. You want to see me, Dad? Chapter 486. Strix put the document down and lifted his head to look at her. Your grandfather is in trouble now. Do you want to go back and have a look at the de Arma family? Maisie was stunned. What happened? The only person left in this world that was connected to her through blood was Hernandez, her maternal grandfather. But how would he be in trouble? Strix nodded. The royal left-wing party has sent someone after your grandfather. While the de Arma family is in chaos right now, they seized the opportunity to take over the territory belonging to them. I'm guessing they're doing this to prevent your grandfather from meddling with the upcoming election. Staslo would hold a presidential election every 6 years. The royal family and the government would not intervene in the election. Perhaps the reason Roger had asked help from the government was to increase his own influence, or maybe he did not only want the throne but the entire Staslo. When Strix did not get any response from Maisie, he spoke again in a slow voice. "If you don't want to go, I won't force you." "I want to go," Maisie said, looking at him with determination. "Even though I don't want anything from the de Arma family, I cannot let other people take it away." Strix smiled and nodded. "All right. I'll let Sadai go with you." After he finished speaking, he summoned Sadai. When Maisie saw the newcomer, she was stunned. "Sir," the person said. Maisie looked at Strix and asked in disbelief, "Is she a girl or a boy?" Sadai was young. She dressed like a boy and had a beautiful face. Maisie had no idea what she had gone through in the past, but she could see she was mature and had a lot of stories to tell in her eyes. Strix chuckled and replied, "Sadai is my most trusted aide. She has been with me since 15 years old. Those people have seen her skills before. She represents me, and I'm relieved to have her there. I'll have someone there to meet you when the time comes." 3 days later, Maisie and Sadai arrived at Staslo. When Maisie once again set her lute in Xena, she did not know why, but her heart shuddered and a complicated emotion rose from her stomach pit. Soon, the people who came to receive them arrived. A man walked up to them reverently and said, "You're Ms. Alice, right? Mr. Henry has asked us to come and pick you up." Maisie nodded at him and got into the car with Sadai. The car drove slowly, and unbeknownst to them, the man sitting in the car beside them withdrew his gaze. Nolan was wearing a Bluetooth earpiece in his left ear. There was a string of data on the tablet sitting in his lap. Quincy, who sat in the passenger seat, turned his head around after hanging up the call and said, "Mr. Goldman, I just received news that Mr. Henry's men have arrived in Staslo. Could it be that people from Metropolis are also involved in this matter?" Quincy was dumbfounded. The Metropolis was a well-known organization in Morwich. They had their influence spread into both the underworld and law enforcement. Besides, M.T. Henry had a close relationship with the government and the royal family of Morwich. And he was also bestowed with the right and power similar to the royal family. Although they knew Maisie was in St. Page was huge. Even if Irwin's men might have brought Maisie to Morwich, it was very unlikely he would hide her in a scary place like the Metropolis. Also, they had heard that Mr. Henry had adopted a girl. That girl was the daughter of the woman he had been in love with, but the media didn't have any idea what the girl looked like. Mr. Henry was very protective of her and refused to let anyone disclose her information. Even if they sent someone to Hants Palace to find out information about the girl, they would come away empty-handed. They had also suspected that the girl wasn't Mr. Henry's biological daughter, but their suspicion was proven wrong after Henry made the paternity test results public. Maisie was truly Stephen's biological daughter, so it was very unlikely that she was related to Mr. Henry by blood. They felt that Mr. Henry must be up to something for sending his men to Staslo. Nolan's eyebrows deeply frowned. He looked outside through the window silently. And the light in his amber eyes dimmed slowly. Chapter 487. The car came to a stop outside of Easton Estate. Easton Estate was huge. The garden was full of irises, which Strix had personally planted. Maisie got out of the car, and the people beside her said respectfully, "Mr. Henry bought Easton Estate when he came to Staslo on business. All of the people here are Mr. Henry's men, and you can tell them whatever you need." Maisie nodded. Then, a maid led her into the manor. The decoration in the manor was similar to that of Hants Palace, which obviously cost a lot of money. She walked up to a couch and sat down. After that, she looked at the man and asked, "Do you know anything about the de Arma family?" "The de Arma family?" The man was stunned for a few seconds before replying. It said that the de Arma family and the Kents have been fighting against each other in the past few years, with the de Arma family gaining the upper hand. However, Hernandez went missing a few days ago. And Roger's men seized the chance to take over the territory belonging to the de Arma family. The people under Hernandez are now in disarray. Maisie squinted her eyes, but did not say anything. She suddenly remembered what Strix had told her back then. The virus had infected her mother when her grandfather was tricked into giving her mother the vaccine. Strix had also told her before that someone was researching the sleeper virus in secret, and these vaccines were just something that the nobles used in their experiment. When the experiment failed, the virus got out, leading to the pandemic. Maisie had guessed that those people were the culprits behind the feud between the Goldmans and the de Arma family in the past. It wasn't Nolan's great-grandfather who had cut off Hernandez's leg. Nor was it Hernandez who had kidnapped Nolan's mother. It was those people. They were the real culprits. Hernandez had found out about these, so he attacked the Kents whenever he had the chance. The Kents were members of the left-wing party. And getting rid of the Kents was the same as removing the left-wing party's wings. The accident that Maisie had got into 3 years ago was also part of their plan. It was just that she did not have any power that year and couldn't do anything. However, things were different now. The maid brought a cup of tea to Maisie, and the man asked, "Ms. Alice, are you going to help the de Arma family?" Maisie lifted the cup of tea and took a sip. My mother was, after all, a member of the de Arma family. Therefore, I need to take back what belongs to the de Arma family and find my grandfather. Taller. The man nodded and continued. Very well, then. Let me know when you've done with your preparations. I'll send someone to help you. Maisie lifted her head from the tea and replied. Let's do it tonight. The night was dark, and several black-clad men were guarding the Zephyr harbor. When they noticed there was fire not far away, 3 of them went over to check it out. Suddenly, a muffled noise came. And the 2 remaining black-clad men collapsed on the ground with their guns. They were then dragged to the back of a wall. The 3 black-clad men arrived at the fire's location. However, they couldn't see anybody else other than a pile of burning rubbish. 2 of the bodyguards were dumbfounded, and when they turned their heads around, the person standing behind them was gone. Just when they were wondering where their comrade was, 2 men approached them and broke their necks with deadly precision. They picked up the guns on the ground and headed toward the cargo ship. A group of people drinking beer and playing cards on the cargo ship. When they heard something, one of them lifted his hand and said, "Someone is here." The other person then said to them, "Go and have a look." That man picked up his weapon and walked out of the cabin. However, he did not return even after a long time had passed. The rest of the people began to feel nervous, and they quickly came out to check what was going on. When they got to the deck, they didn't see anybody around. Then, a voice rang out above them. "Hey!" They jerked their heads back, and the people hiding in the dark jumped onto the ship, launching an attack on them before they could react. Tonight, the black-clad men stationed at the de Arma family's territory were ambushed. Chapter 488. At Roger's mansion. The sound of a cup falling to the floor could be heard from the study. The old man with silver hair had a strong physique, and his turquoise eyes were as sharp as an eagle's. "A bunch of idiots. Have you found out who the hell did it?" The middle-aged man lowered his head and replied, "Your Highness, we haven't found out who did it. However, the way they didn't leave anyone alive is identical to that person's from the metropolis." The person from the metropolis he was talking about was none other than Sadie, Mr. Henry's subordinate. Sadie was notorious for her ruthlessness, and Patrick, who was a cruel man himself, was nothing compared to her. After all, Patrick would still give the person he captured a chance to live, but Sadie was different. She would not let those who had fallen into her hands live. Sadie was a notoriously vicious woman in the metropolis. When Mr. Henry was away, Sadie would take over the metropolis. She represented Mr. Henry, and the fact that she had intervened meant that Mr. Henry intended to do so as well. Roger clenched his fists tightly, and his veins bulged out of the back of his hand. D***it. How dare those people from the metropolis put their nose into the De Arma family's affair? Go check it out immediately. I want to know if the metropolis is in this or not. In the meantime, Quincy walked into the room with another man. All of the lights in the room were turned off save for the table lamp next to the computer. Nolan was sitting on a big chair. He was wearing a bathrobe and holding a glass of unfinished wine with his left hand. Mr. Goldman, Quincy said. Someone has gotten rid of Roger's men that occupied the De Arma family's territory. Nolan was typing on the keyboard, and he froze when he heard what Quincy said. Half of his face was covered by the shadow, and Quincy couldn't read the emotion in his eyes. He leaned backward and tapped the desk with his finger. Who did it? Quincy looked toward the man beside him, and the man replied, judging from the evidence we've gathered, it was done by the people from the metropolis. Their move was clean, and there were no extra wounds on the bodies. All of them were killed in one strike. The man pondered for a moment before adding, I'm guessing that they must have ambushed them. There are no signs of a fight on the scene. They didn't even get to fire their guns. Quincy was taken aback. The people from the metropolis usually acted openly, so he was surprised to find that they would resort to ambushing them at night. Besides, he wondered why the metropolis would launch an attack on Roger's men. Was it because of the De Arma family? He looked at Nolan. But there was no expression on Nolan's face. He appeared to be locked in his thoughts. After a short while, he lifted his head and asked, Who did Mr. Henry send this time? The man replied, It must be Sadie. She's the most ruthless person in the metropolis. And I'm sure that she must be the one who wiped out Roger's men. Quincy had heard of Sadie from the metropolis. She was known to be a competent woman, and even if Hans, him, and the night banquet members attacked her simultaneously, they might not be able to take her down. Mr. Henry had been a mysterious being, and the fact that he was surrounded by incredible people such as Erwin and Sadie showed that he was not someone to be trifled with. Quincy suddenly thought of something and asked, curiously, Sadie is always by Mr. Henry's side. So why would he send her to Staslo? What is the connection between Mr. Henry and the De Arma family? When the man heard Quincy's question, he replied, Oh yeah, according to the information we received, there is this one girl, Ms. Alice. In Mr. Henry's team that went to Staslo. Alice? Quincy was stunned and looked toward Nolan. Nolan's eyes darkened, and he asked meaningfully, Has anyone seen her face after she landed at Staslo? The man shook his head and said, Nope. Nolan narrowed his eyes slightly. But he did not say anything. After a short while, he asked Quincy to take the man away. Chapter 489. Nolan turned his eyes back onto the computer screen. It showed the information about Alice, but there was very little content. There was not even a picture of her. At the same time, he received a message on his phone. It was from Wesley, an old friend of his in Staslo. A few days later, the refusal of Mr. Henry's daughter, Ms. Alice Henry, to meet Prince Roger's people led to a heated debate. One of them was the daughter of Mr. Henry, who was highly valued by the royal family and had the same power as the royal family in Morwich, while the other was a member of the royal family in Staslo. It was rare for someone to disrespect the prince. Of course, she only disrespected the prince. After all, Ms. Alice did not reject it when the royal family invited her with courtesy. In the ornate and grand white living room, the maids were standing at the side and serving tea. Queen Anna was in her 50s. She was the niece of the eldest princess, a descendant of the Miller royal bloodline. Her amber eyes also reminded Maisie of someone. This was not the first time Maisie was being received by the royal family. 9 years ago, when she was still the designer Zora, Queen Anna's daughter had had a meeting with her. This was because her daughter would get married, and she loved Victorian style. Therefore, she had asked her to design a Victorian-style tiara for her. That being said, This was the first time Maisie saw Queen Anna in person. She was graceful, elegant, and very classy. "Ms. Alice, you remind me of a person." Maisie was stunned. She did not expect that the Queen would say something like this to her. She smiled and asked, "Who might that person be?" Queen Anna gracefully lifted the cup and replied, "Granddaughter of Lord Hernandez?" Maisie lowered her eyes and smiled faintly. "Really? Actually, she's my mother." Queen Anna was shocked. "You're Lord Hernandez's granddaughter?" Maisie nodded. Queen Anna put the cup down and continued, "I see. Now I see why you're helping him." Maisie was stunned for a moment, her jaw tightly set. It took her a few seconds before she parted her lips and asked, "Did you know something?" Queen Anna chuckled as if she was tickled pink by Maisie and said, "Of course, I know something. I know everything my uncle is doing." The de Arma family used to be very loyal to the royal family. However, after Lord Hernandez's father passed away, the de Arma family stopped inquiring about the affairs of the royal family. A hint of disappointment crossed Queen Anna's eyes, but Maisie did not say anything. After all, she was just an outsider, and Queen Anna shouldn't have told her anything about the affairs of the royal family. But apparently, the royal family was not as peaceful as it seemed to be. In fact, it was rotten inside. People would always fight for power and wealth, regardless of their social status, let alone the members of the royal family. It was not that Queen Anna did not want to do anything. It was just that her power was much weaker compared to that of Roger's. After Maisie finished her conversation with Queen Anna, she headed out of the stateroom and came to the spacious and beautiful garden, where Saydai was waiting for her. Mr. Henry wants you to attend a banquet tonight. It's very important as it's related to the partnership with Mr. David, the new president of the Ashton Group." Maisie asked, "Partnership?" Saydai nodded. Although Mr. David is only in his mid-30s, he comes from a big family. His father is a member of Stoslo's Congress. He's a man of integrity. Roger is going to make a move on the election to recommend his own people. Mr. David is also a key figure in this election. Mr. Henry said that if you want to help the de Arma family, then you'll need to get Mr. David's trust before Roger does. Maisie fell silent. She had kind of offended Roger after turning down the meeting with him several times. She was confident that Roger wouldn't give up so easily, and Strix was the reason he hadn't made any move on her yet. However, Maisie was waiting for a chance. She was waiting for the moment Roger got drowned in his ego. She would then swoop in and get rid of him. She hadn't gotten any news about her grandfather yet. However, since she was already in the game, she could only take the step forward. Chapter 490. The Ashton Group hosted a grand banquet at the hotel's banquet hall in the evening to celebrate the Ashton Group's revival. Why were they celebrating the Ashton Group's revival? It was known that the Ashton Group had been operating in Stoslo for 60 years. However, due to the recession, nobody wanted to take over the Ashton Group after the former chairman declared bankruptcy. After joining the Ashton Group and becoming its largest shareholder and chairman, Wesley brought the Ashton Group back to life. When the press had asked him why he would take over the Ashton Group, he just said that he had worked as a part-timer before attending university. He liked the Ashton Group very much, so he did not want to see the company go down the drain just like that. It was considered a straightforward yet positive answer. No matter if it was true or not, the Ashton Group's market value had indeed increased by 70% within 1 year ever since Wesley took over. It was the second largest company in the country now, and everyone was paying attention to it. Wesley had invited all his friends from different sectors to join him in the celebration. The invitation card for Mr. Henry was sent to Maisie's phone, so she attended on his behalf. There were a lot of guests inside the spacious banquet hall. Before the banquet started, all of them made conversation with each other. Other than some interesting events in the world of business, most of them were talking about Mr. Henry's mysterious daughter. They knew that Mr. Henry was a friend of Wesley. Although Mr. Henry was from the underworld, he enjoyed the same rights as the royal family in Morwich. He was involved in the business world as well, so he was wealthy. As for his daughter, they had heard that Mr. Henry had just adopted her not long ago. If anyone could marry his daughter, it would be like getting all the wealth he had gathered throughout his whole life. However, judging from his social status, it was only right and natural for his daughter to marry a count or a prince. Unexpectedly, even though his daughter was in Stoslow right now, she refused to meet with Prince Roger, which intrigued the crowd even more. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the entrance. They all thought everyone was already here, but little did they expect someone would show up late. They turned their heads and looked toward the entrance. The newcomer had a voluptuous figure. She was dressed in a slim-fitting burgundy suit lined with a high-collared chiffon shirt, and there was a ruby pendant at the center of the collar. Her crop pants had her ankle exposed to the air, and her stilettos made her look even taller. She had tied her bluish-black hair in a ponytail and was wearing a golden mask that covered the upper half of her delicate face. There were 4 people behind her, in which 3 of them were from Morwich. The remaining one was a tomboyish, short-haired girl. And the crowd soon recognized who she was. She was none other than the ruthless woman who used to stay by Mr. Henry's side, Sadie. So, did that mean this woman was Ms. Alice? Even if she was wearing a mask, they could all see that she had a delicate face. Maisie walked toward Wesley with a steady and firm pace on her stilettos. The crystal lights of the hall reflected on her mask and gave off sparkling light. Wesley was talking with someone with a glass of wine in his hand. When he saw Maisie, he was stunned. Maisie stretched her arm out without any hesitation and greeted, "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. David. I'm Alice." Wesley had heard of Alice a long time ago. He handed the wineglass to a person beside him, whipped up a smile on his face, and grabbed her hand to exchange a handshake with her. "Ms. Alice, I've heard a lot about you. Did Mr. Henry send you here?" "Yes. My father asked me to attend your banquet in his place and asked me to bring you a congratulatory gift."